Check in. All clear. Yo, I need help here. I need help. I'm planted.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Bluepilling. I am your host, the Prophet, Divest the A10, hiding behind an AI-generated voice. A quick explanation of Bluepilling before we get to today's topic. I have become increasingly aware of just how easily manipulated and brain-dead the masses are. Regardless of political affiliation you have been duped into, believing fake news by talking head commentators appealing to your slave-based moral values using schizoid logic. My goal with this series is to cut through the nonsense and educate you, the viewer, on the topic, with a special emphasis on when these discussions are dominated by an anti-establishment narrative. Naming this series Bluepilling is to dissect the term red-pilled. In the matrix, to be red-pilled is to learn that our mundane reality is actually a computer simulation established by machines who use cloned humans as thermal batteries. If someone told you that they were red-pilled and seriously believed that reality was a simulation created by machines who used humans as batteries, then they are a dumbass. The mundane reality presented by Bluepilling is what we actually reside in outside of the delusions of sad losers who were manipulated by outside agents. So, to be blue-pilled is to get your head out of your ass and accept the obvious truth over the fantastic world conjured up in someone else's head. For this first episode, I will be discussing the energy transition and the role of nuclear fission in our energy infrastructure. To give you a quick rundown, nuclear is a low-carbon source of energy because unlike burning a fossil fuel to generate electricity, there is no combustion that releases carbon into the atmosphere, though there is radioactive waste produced as a byproduct. Because of its low carbon intensity, nuclear is a green energy source similar to wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal power. As the red-pilled narrative goes, it's the best source of power, but it has been unfairly maligned in favor of renewables or fossil fuels by one group or the other. My personal opinion on the topic is that nuclear energy was the best source of electricity, but now it has been surpassed recently within the last few decades by renewable energy. From henceforth, the red-pilled will be referred to as nuke cells, and their ideology is Nukeceldom. Unfortunately, the nuke cells don't really seem to be concerned about the reality of the situation or improving anything, and instead spend their time finger-wagging and posting misinformation online. They are more concerned about finding people who agree with them and thinking they are better than everyone else instead of actually knowing what they're talking about. This makes sense because Nukeceldom is born out of slave morality, and so they work to fit in with the herd and undercut anything that someone who stands out would do out of envy. And while they can't achieve a physical victory over renewable energy, they can at least achieve a spiritual victory by cursing their betters. Nukeceldom is along the same lines as gold standards in that they propose a non-starter solution to a problem that doesn't really exist based off an obsolete system on a topic they know nothing about, sheepishly bleating out the words that they heard before, like an illiterate peasant reciting a prayer from the bishop at Mass. Because of this, they have completely lost sight of the real issues at hand, which is pollution, ecological destruction, security, and man-made climate change. Everything you need to know about how rotten-minded these people, and I use that term loosely, are is the fact they will sheepishly quack out fossil fuel misinformation relentlessly to disparage environmentalists for being the enemy of their nuketopia. As the righteous climb to the heavens and look to the sun for strength and guidance, the nuke cell dances around the golden calf, a doomed idol that was forged through their misplaced faith and wasted treasure. I have come as a Levite to put the idolaters and the arrogant to the sword. To start, let's look at our current situation and what we are working towards based on the energy transition, the shift from carbon-intensive fossil fuels as the backbone of our economy to the low-carbon energy sources. I can give you a pretty clear picture of how the energy transition will go. We're already in the early stage of it right now, and it's inevitable that we will continue transitioning to a renewable-based economy. Wind and solar are now cheaper than fossil fuels in terms of direct costs, which means that with no other incentive, these are the best option from a cold economical standpoint. This is important because fossil fuels dominated the economy, even though there were alternative sources of energy like nuclear and renewables available for decades, simply because these clean energy sources weren't cost competitive with fossil fuels. In addition, most of the world's wealth is held up in advanced economies which would gain strategic advantages from reducing their reliance on fossil fuels, giving them even more incentive to transition and decouple themselves from Saudi Arabia and Russia. Then you have to consider the social cost from spewing poison into the air and water by burning fossil fuels. This is also of major concern to any intelligent person and makes the far less destructive renewable energy sources far more appealing. This energy transition will also disincentivize the extraction of new fossil fuels. Most oil infrastructure is established by advanced economies like the US, China, and Europe to keep the gas flowing. There's no need for projects like the Nord Stream pipeline if they can get more strategic flexibility and bang for their buck by installing renewables. Demand for fossil fuels will drop, and consequently their price on the market will drop too. It will be difficult for petrostates to make a profit on fossil fuels in the first place and disincentivize their extraction. This already happened in Venezuela, where the United States divested themselves from the region and made it uneconomical for them to develop their oil infrastructure. In addition, it will become more viable for advanced economies to produce carbon-neutral electrofuels using cheaper energy sourced from renewables, along with carbon capture and hydrogen extracted from natural deposits or from splitting water, which will reduce the demand for things like aviation fuel and diesel in sectors that can't be directly decarbonized by using battery electric systems or electricity. But there's no real place for nuclear fission on the energy grid in the future. Nuke cells can cry all they want, but the fact of the matter is that no one is moving towards using nuclear power as their primary energy source, and with good reason. Countries with any significant share of nuclear power like France, Slovakia, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine are working off of 40 to 50-year-old reactors that won't last much longer. They are at best operating them based on the sunk cost fallacy and showing half-hearted attempts to support the industry that could be accurately described as virtue signaling, or withholding their inevitable retirement for a few years in response to the energy scares. As an example, if France was serious about going all in on nuclear power like Emmanuel Macron claims, then they would need to construct 140 new nuclear reactors to replace their current 56 reactors and another 84 to decarbonize their economy based on their current energy consumption. Not even including the potential economic growth they would want to occur over this period, and the increased energy demand for that which would have to be met by even more reactors. Instead, the French government has 6 nuclear reactors under construction and has been talking about building another 8 on top of that for a total of 14 reactors. The so-called nuclear renaissance in France consists of reducing the number of working nuclear reactors in the country to almost a tenth of the number currently in use by 2040. The potential that they may only gut it down to 1/4 the number of nuclear reactors in service today. Keep in mind this is the most pro-nuclear and heavily nuclear-invested country on the planet. The reason being is because Macron is trying to secure votes with empty platitudes towards the nuke cell lobby in France. Because of the collective stupidity of the masses, Nukeceldom is a popular position to hold. But their proposition is economic suicide, and so a politician can only play lip service to the nuke cell utopia since it can never be realized. He's just kicking the can down the road until he leaves office and lets his successor provide a serious solution to the problem. The nuclear renaissance in the United States, on the other hand, consisted of a series of cost overruns which caused the state of Georgia to foot the bill for the most expensive power plant ever constructed and the cancellation of the world's first small modular reactors for commercial use due to cost overruns, along with keeping some old outdated reactors on life support by using federal funding. Another nuclear renaissance is occurring in China, with their plan to introduce 81 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2030, bearing in mind that this is including nuclear reactors that began operation in the 1980s, compared to the 87 gigawatts of solar and 67 gigawatts of wind they installed in 2022 alone. Well, why is it that every government on the planet has collectively dismissed nuclear as a desirable source of energy? Is it a grand conspiracy by globalists, oil companies, environmentalists, or maybe it's an ethnicity like the Jews, Arabs, Russians, or Chinese? It's actually very simple. Nuclear power is not a real solution to the climate crisis caused by fossil fuels, hence why it is a mature technology introduced over 70 years ago that has failed to displace fossil fuels in any sector enough to cause a major impact on climate change. The obvious problem with the feasibility of nuclear power is the exorbitant cost. It's the most expensive source of energy that's in significant use today. For the same cost, you could produce more energy from other sources. Political leaders have to answer to the masses of moronic children who could easily be manipulated into supporting policies that only hurt them, so it would be impossible to convince these dullards to pay more on their electric bill so that they didn't rely on salting the earth with carcinogens to heat their home. The cost of nuclear power is obfuscated, but reality is something that cannot be ignored. As an example, the French state-owned energy company EDF loses tens of billions of euros every year in operation because it is forced to sell nuclear energy at a loss because of artificial price caps. Their budget is then balanced by getting subsidies from the French government so that they can continue to operate. This just works to obfuscate the true cost of electricity for the French people, who pay less in their energy bills but then have to pay either in taxes or by having public services slashed. It's reasonable to conclude that nuclear energy is a major contributing factor to the French government decision to reform the pension system in order to save capital by making it more difficult for someone to enter into the pension system, and then using the money saved to subsidize the cost of electricity. On the other end of the spectrum, the German government took the correct but unpopular approach of shuttering nuclear power once it became cheaper to install new renewable energy capacity than to operate existing nuclear power plants, simply because that meant their economic resources could be better spent by installing new renewable energy at a larger scale than what could be accomplished budgeting that money to sustain nuclear reactors. I'm sure you've heard about how this was a disastrous policy decision that costed money and increased pollution. But as we can see, all of the new capacity in the German energy grid came from renewables, while fossil fuel consumption has declined from 60% of German electricity to 46% since 2011, when nuclear started to be divested. So if you believe that, then you're a jackass, because you didn't do your due diligence and research the topic. Your mother probably held her legs closed while she was in labor with you, like what happened to Rosemary Kennedy. That's why her yeast infection is the most intelligent thing to ever come out of her vagina. Another key point to keep in mind is that the German government is not acting altruistically, but instead shifted to renewables because of cold realism. If they actually cared about stopping fossil fuels for the sake of stopping fossil fuels, then they would have gone on a much more extreme path. Instead, the German police are going and kneeling on the necks of serious environmentalists, despite the fact the Greens are part of the majority coalition. But they managed to displace a lot more fossil fuels than any environmentalist ever has by affecting change in an industrialized nation. As previously mentioned, this is the dichotomy of the master morality of the strong versus the slave morality of the weak. This is because environmentalists and nuke cells are one and the same. Even though the nuke cell is so brain-dead, he curses the environmentalist. Now we'll get to talk about some of the unique problems with nuclear power beyond its exorbitant cost. First problem. Nuclear power is not flexible in operation. It takes about 24 hours to go from 0 to 100% output, so it can't adjust to meet power demands quickly, where a gas turbine can go from 0 to 100 in 10 minutes, and a battery can go in 10 milliseconds, in addition to the fact that running a nuclear reactor below max capacity is just wasting money since it sells less electricity, while you're still having to pay the same cost to operate it. But if you were to try to use nuclear power as a baseload in a low-carbon grid, it would be impossible for the reactors to adjust their output quickly enough to match the fluctuating nature of power demand. You would need to have some other form of dispatchable energy that you could turn on and off when needed, meaning you would need energy storage to harvest excess nuclear energy production during low periods or to burn fossil fuels. This defeats the purpose of using nuclear power for its high capacity factor. If you have invested in energy storage infrastructure, then you can just use renewable electricity to charge those same batteries at a much lower price and produce more electricity. Second problem. Nuclear power takes way longer to install than renewables. If you were to vow to replace all energy sources with nuclear, then at the earliest you would start getting electricity by 2039, since it takes about 15 years for a plant to come into operation. Until then, your options would be to either use renewables as an intermediary, or continue to burn fossil fuels and release more greenhouse gases. This is what the French government meant when they said they weren't going to worry about reducing carbon emissions in the future to focus on nuclear energy. Because any investment in the nuclear grid comes at the expense of renewable energy that could displace a much greater quantity of fossil fuels much quicker. If you've been paying attention, you've noticed I've been equating Nukeceldom with increased pollution. This also gets to the heart of the problem with new nuclear power. The dichotomy is, as France has proven, showing any support for nuclear power entails burning more fossil fuels, while those who divest nuclear power are able to push their resources into decarbonization by producing more carbon-free energy with the money saved. It's also telling that the one nuke cell political party in Germany is also the one that is sucking Putin's cock. They're also hostile to renewable energy. That must have been some serious miscommunication on the part of the FSB, considering that the Russian government wants to use global warming to unlock arable land in Siberia. That, or they know that nuclear can't displace the demand for fossil fuels like renewables can. Third problem. You can't trust most of the world with nuclear power. We already have plenty of countries that can't be trusted with nuclear weapons, such as Russia, North Korea, and Pakistan. So the idea that we can get places like Uganda or Afghanistan to replace fossil fuels with nuclear power is ludicrous on the face of it, since nuclear is way more expensive than the fossil fuels they are using now, and so the only reason any dictatorship would pursue nuclear energy would be to acquire infrastructure and technology to create nuclear weapons like Iran is doing currently and North Korea, India, Pakistan, and South Africa have done historically. Plus, even if their governments aren't evil, it also represents an increased security threat from terrorists who could attack a nuclear power plant or steal nuclear materials for a dirty bomb. This was the premise of Metal Gear. The only realistic option we have for improvement for most of the world's energy grid is to sell renewables that are cheaper than fossil fuels for their domestic use in order to give them a reason to pollute less. Fourth problem. Nuclear has no merit over geothermal energy, which is similarly a non-intermittent power source but cheaper. It also has other major advantages such as not needing to be refueled, not creating nuclear waste, and not needing any form of water cooling. This means that geothermal can be placed anywhere without needing a body of water nearby, unlike nuclear. Fifth problem. New nuclear technologies will not reverse these trends. It's unlikely that nuclear power will ever be able to become cheaper than geothermal energy, regardless of what kind of technology was developed, and it will be almost impossible to beat wind and solar. This is because of some very general rules about thermodynamics and economics. Bigger and simpler is better. When it comes to thermodynamics, bigger is more efficient, which is why we prefer bigger things for industrial applications, bigger wind turbines, bigger cargo ships, bigger jet engines. So small modular reactors will never be cost competitive with the reactors in service now, which are already non-viable because they are too expensive. This is why the US canceled their small modular reactors. On the other hand, nuclear fusion reactors have yet to achieve any significant energy return or sustained operation despite using a massive amount of infrastructure investment to even operate. When it comes to economics, simpler processes are better unless you yield much more productivity. A fusion reactor is copying the sun on a minuscule scale, using a massive amount of energy to support the process, where renewables use significantly less energy and harvest a good portion of the energy from the sun in a less complicated pathway. Fission uses elements releasing energy under artificial conditions, where geothermal uses energy provided under natural conditions. The one thing renewables have in common with fossil fuels is that they are relying on more naturally available energy than nuclear fission or fusion is. Sixth problem. Nuclear reactors are still vulnerable to other environmental factors that wind and solar are not, reducing their efficiency, like what happened in 2022. The sharp increase in energy prices in the European Union didn't occur because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, since those same fossil fuels were simply being sold to India and China at a steep discount by the Russians, and then resold to the Europeans at the same rate as they would have paid for them if they had bought them from Russia directly. Nor was it the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sabotage, which occurred a month after energy prices hit their peak in August of 2022. Instead, the primary cause of the sharp increase in energy prices was due to the failure of the French nuclear fleet. While many of their reactors had to undergo emergency repairs, and the ones that remained operational operated at reduced efficiency due to there not being enough water and the water being too warm to cool their reactors adequately. So the EDF had to import electricity from neighboring countries to make up the difference, and so their neighbors had to burn more coal and natural gas to produce the electricity to meet the French demand for energy, driving up demand when it was already high, as Europe was trying to fill their gas reserves for the coming winter. You can also see the price of electricity spiked in Belgium too, despite the fact they get most of their energy from nuclear, because a large portion of their electricity is imported from France, and they had to shift to importing it from other neighbors burning fossil fuels too, while not having the same price controls as France. On the other hand, a fleet of windmills and solar panels is far too decentralized for half of the fleet to ever go offline, and the summer heat and drought would actually increase their productivity. With the 180 billion euros the French spent on subsidizing the EDF since 2022, they could have earmarked the installation and maintenance of 80 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity for the next 20 years. For these reasons, nuclear power only has very niche applications where it is actually competitive, such as providing power for a military submarine or aircraft carrier. So shut the fuck up and stop bleating about nuclear power. If you actually care about these issues, the best thing you can do is to get center or left-wing politicians in power in your government and look into ways that you can make your lifestyle more energy efficient, such as installing more energy-efficient appliances in your home. Thanks for listening. If you made it to the end of the video, hopefully you came away a more blue-pilled individual. If you haven't been convinced, then make sure to post your asinine arguments in the comments section so I can debate you in a public forum and make you look stupid in front of an audience that can hopefully avoid making the same mistakes you have. Until next time, this is the Prophet Deves the A10 signing out.